While the eventual death of the GOAT's composition has been talked about and repeated several times now, we are still here and we still have GOATs to watch and to play. Now, it reveals something interesting, not just about the composition itself, but the structure and the context that Overwatch is played in, and how future metas, and especially now GOATs, this highly resistant to change comp, might say something about the nature of the game we're playing. Now, Blizzard, for several consecutive patches, I think it's at least 3, has tried to deal serious blows to this composition by nerfing Brigitte, by nerfing Lucio, certainly the certain interactions between armor and damage were sort of aimed at them. All has done nothing. GOATS has shown itself to be highly resistant by also being fairly adaptable to different situations. Not just how the comp allows for several switches in some positions. So for instance, Zenyatta going out for Ana, or even Sombra GOATs being played, but the general archetype of Zen GOATs, so that had then been figured out with Reinhardt, has shown itself to be highly adaptable and is still the dominant meta composition on most maps, and crucially, where it isn't a GOATs variation of the pure vanilla GOATs, so something like Monkey GOATs, still fills most of the needs that compositions might have, or teams might have, and therefore it's hard to conceive of an immediate change in the meta just based on the state of what we're seeing right now. Now, there's 2 options of what is actually going on. The first one is that in the current context of the Overwatch League, of how also Overwatch is played outside the Overwatch League and contenders, the way how pressure is applied, how close game days are, how it's all league structures, that it is a system that sort of lends itself to GOATs-like compositions where you have a really solid archetype and you just practice this and practice this and practice this, and it seems to be working very well on almost all maps. And if it doesn't, you can switch to one archetype, or the composition that you then can counter it with is probably not high maintenance to play. Still, the absolute best teams get away with GOATs. So the question then is that because it is opportune for them, time effective for them? Because, okay, let's think of it this way, right? Let's say we're currently in a state of meta where there is theoretically a composition that when played after, let's say, 500 practice hours, you start to see it consistently beat GOATs, let's say, with a 60 to 65, 70% win chance. Who's going to take that chance? Well, in open systems where certain players aren't in league formats and may compete against each other and also have more, there's more inter-scrimming, so even the lesser teams get scrims from the absolute best teams, and where we don't have these league structures, it's possible that one team just said, okay, we suck at GOATs, let's just go all in on this one composition and then see where it leads us, and then even high-level teams can sort of emulate this, make it better, perfect it. The problem is it's really not that time efficient for most of the teams to do it. So I already argued in a piece that I wrote for VP Esports is that the top teams have no reason to want GOATs to go away. They still super reliably beat the middle tier teams. We are currently, I think there's 3 teams that are still in the running for a perfect stage, of course helped by the asymmetric structure of the schedule, but still have very reliable results. The problem is that, as it was explained to me, for instance, from the coach of the Montreal Rebellion, Dream, he told me basically what is going on is the midfield, there's maybe like 50 things that you need to do in order to be a top GOATs team, but the mid-tier in Overwatch League cannot do these 10, and then that makes the composition sort of unreliable, and that's why we see the parity in the middle. Now, as we go on in the seasons, there seems to be this crystallization of a fourth tier. So we don't just have this huge middle and then the bottom teams that are everywhere from 3 to 5 teams, I would say. But now we also have a second tier, like filled with the Dallas Fury or with Seoul Dynasty or teams like this, right? So to connect this to that, it is possible that we are in an unsolved state of meta, and that just by the structure of how the Overwatch circuits work, that we haven't figured it out. Here's the second option, though. And that one should be a scary one, not just for fans, but most definitely for developers. Because if this state of affairs is the reality of what we're playing in, Overwatch sadly reveals itself as quite a shallow game in terms of options you may have, and also a massive outlier in the context of esports. So the concept I would apply here, and that's something I came up with, is meta entropy. Meta entropy is a state where I say that is the state where the meta has been solved. We know the best meta archetypes. It's not necessarily, it's only on the meta level. It's not about strategy, routing, or whatever with GOATs, but it's strictly about which compositions of heroes you play, and then what kind of style of that composition should be played. And if that is consistently dominant and will never ever change, even if we are running AI through, let's say we have one of these sophisticated programs that are currently going into these other games such as StarCraft or Dota 2, where we give them human reactions, so we definitely set a benchmark so they aren't doing unnatural stuff where it's all headshots or whatever, but actually human aim with the error rate that we can expect, and then just let those seemingly human simulations run for a significant amount of time. If we then look at the code and figure out that it's still GOATs, that would be a tragedy for Overwatch as a game and would really require massive changes to the game, because at that point, to have that level of solved or entropy within a metagame is, in the history of esports, completely unprecedented. So let's think of a game like Brood War. Brood War was one of the most professionally explored games of all time. There were professional coaches in a high intensity environment. The training schedules were extreme 16-hour-a-day schedules, practice sessions, strategy talk, and that across an entire country in South Korea, which we also know does it pretty well, and then all over the globe as well, where foreigners try to keep up. Most of the time didn't, but the point being that even when such an industry was behind it, 5 years in, there might still be massive meta shifts where a new concept was found out and turned a matchup on its head and could bring about a new meta position. Now, let's be honest here, because while there hadn't been balanced patches to the game, what there were different maps. So it isn't completely that the game had been stagnant this entire time and then after several years something found out something about the game. It was more that there was still some fluency, still not as much as we expect in Overwatch. Now, if we are in fact in a state where we don't have, for instance, we have already figured out all the concepts there are to Overwatch, and even if we haven't, maybe they are not dominant types, maybe they can't beat GOATs because it's so reliable, it's so good on all these maps, that would be honestly a tragedy to Overwatch. I personally am an agnostic to that we're currently in a meta entropy state. I cannot see a possibility where with such short time in the game and with the structures as they are, that we have figured out all there is to know. It seems very likely to me that there probably wouldn't be one meta, but it probably would be a map meta, where people, like, if they had infinite amount of time, compositions would switch around based on the map architecture, and then goats would maybe be played on some maps. I just can't see it being played with that dominance. However, I have coaches telling me that goats as an archetype, because it's so highly adaptable, because it's so resistant, because its counters are so weak to it, that we might be in a state of this. Maybe not, in the hardest of interpretations, so it's not a full state, but we're pretty close, according to those coaches. And that is honestly a scary position to be in. Now, to tag on to this, I think that is not a healthy state of affairs. It's not just that we don't want Overwatch to be this basic. Now, goats played at the highest level is not basic. It's just that the dimensions around it should be way more spread out, and we should be able to conceive of compositions that down the line could beat it or hopefully get there somehow. But currently, there is not an inkling in coaches where they say, okay, this is an archetype that could be run in a similar fashion and then consistently beat goats. And people have been trying. Now, the problem is the following. I think, and I argued in that piece, that the worst teams should be trying this, because it's very unlikely that they're ever going to catch up to the top teams. And the problem, of course, being that some of these teams have very bad map scores, so in order to make it into the play-ins, they would have to become world beaters for the second half of the season, right? In order to get an even score, like 50% win rate should probably get you into the play-ins. And with that said, should take gambles and hope to the gods that not only maybe they have figured out by sheer luck, so that presupposes that we're not in a meta entropy state, that we have the second possibility that there are other compositions that could eventually reliably beat goats. Now, here's the gamble. They would have to take a sheer leap of faith and see if that down the line can work what they're fixing on. Now, I personally think the probability of that happening is, of course, very low, but it is also that they are getting much better. Now, if we're talking about just finishing out the season strong, so these guys have jobs, that's a different discussion. I personally would always structure my team's aspirations as to still be able to win the Overwatch League, even if it is through an uphill battle and taking big chances. Now, excuse me. It is also the case that maybe some teams could gamble into a state where there is a next patch and it hits goats hard enough that they just luck out and they have a sort of like a competitive advantage because they have already figured out something that resembles the eventual meta comp. It's not likely, but if you do your research, I think you can take guesstimates. That still leaves you an option in order to get into the playoffs, right? I will also argue at this point that it is an absolute necessity that a PTR patch that almost unfairly targets goats with no real opportunities for it to be a composition longer, at least for the later states of practice for these top teams. I think that one has to hit in the next couple of weeks. I would actually argue it has about maximum 2 weeks to hit this servers, probably more like 1, where it's a really, really harsh nerf to goats, because on the 12th of May, it's the last day of the playoffs for Stage 2, and then we have almost a month of stop in the Overwatch League. We have the mid-season break, and only at the 7th of June can we then continue. Now, of course, this presents itself as an amazing opportunity to introduce a patch and then have these teams figure out something so they're not completely gambling on what might happen to them after the break, right? So 4 weeks of practice seems to be decent amount of time in order to see if what they're playing makes sense, and then also to sophisticate them on a level where it's both enjoyable to watch and also reliable to play. And of course, the problem being that people will then argue that there is, of course, because of the asymmetric schedule, it would be sort of unfair for teams that, let's say, you've already played Shock twice, and then maybe Vancouver twice, and you don't play them in the second half. What about those? Like, they are so overwhelming on GOATs. Well, I say yes, but the alternative is probably worse. Now, one thing I will say is, I cannot see that Vancouver Titans and San Francisco Shock would be any less dominant in whatever meta you can throw at them. I think they are sort of like an assemblage of, and I would count NYXL to a lesser degree Gladiators to that as well, where whatever meta you throw at them, at that team, at the coaches, they would probably figure out something that, while maybe not as dominant as they are now, eventually would probably turn into that state. They are just this good of a team. Now, you would have outliers, such as, for instance, sort of the reverse being the case last year with Boston Uprising, the first 3 stages, playing dive, then becoming the best dive team, arguably, and then in stage 4, a completely different meta hitting. And this brings me to the next point, is the reasoning for why we need this very soon is because the undesirable state, in my opinion, that we had last season. Now, the last stage being on a completely different meta was already kind of meh, in my opinion. I personally always am of the opinion that when you select when you have a qualifying stage for a playoff or for a tournament, it should probably be under the same circumstances as the playoffs are played. Otherwise, you really threaten the quality of your eventual playoffs, and you have a higher probability of ruining those playoffs necessarily, of course. Now, the worst thing that could happen, and it would honestly really upset me, is if all 4 stages were to be played in GOATs, and then only the playoffs are played on something completely different. Maybe we're playing Bunker, or maybe we're playing Dive again. There's only so many archetypes we have, or can conceive of in Overwatch. So, or something with Widow, Double Sniper, or something like this, right? Now, imagine the clown fiesta that this could potentially turn into. Not only would you have certain teams that have grinded into that position, but especially, let's say, those in the play-ins, they wouldn't have received that patch yet. Can we necessarily say that someone that was on the 12th spot will also figure out the new meta with any satisfying level of degree? It's highly unlikely, in my opinion. And now, if that 12th team has figured out GOATs over the season and learned it, and then you would have them in the playoffs, if they then win games, that could be very satisfying. Personally, if the 12th team comes in and just on the back of a meta switch keeps beating top-level teams, that is not an interesting narrative. That is a forced one. And even if you're someone who likes underdog victories, that should leave a bad taste in your mouth. It is not about the achievement of those players and of those staff as only then. It is also about the meta being completely changed and therefore facilitating that and ultimately not rewarding the best teams of the year. Now, I'm sure this is also a little bit of a European take, because that's probably also sometimes is the case in sports. Now, keep in mind, in sports, this is a very different thing, right? It's only down to the team. Form is dedicated only by the sheer power of will. Yes, also structure, I would say, of the league. Do you have injured players and whatever? But in esports, because of meta changes, that is the severe one. It is not about only about then the team that finds it in themselves to be champions. It is also sadly about the game changing in a way that handed them an easier route than those who've grinded to be in the deserving spots. right? And personally, I find this to be a highly undesirable case. So I think this week, maybe a PTR pitch, even if we're not getting that. I mean, I think it would be bad, but not terrible to have stage 3 on goats and then stage 4 on a new patch. If we're going from the possibility that we are not living in meta entropy, maybe some of the teams come out of that break and have a solution to goats. At this point, I wouldn't take the chances if I was a developer. I would absolutely hit that composition hard. Now, personally, I'm someone who would play the entire thing in goats. I wouldn't care that much. But I also realize that it seems to be hurting the league and the game in terms of how players receive it, how their opinion trickles down to the fan base, how the fan base receives that comp. And I think for that very reason, we probably need some variety and should be getting a PTR patch soon that should honestly slit the throat of goats as we know it. Thanks for watching.